I'd like now to turn the floor over to Dr. Vicki Ferrini from Columbia University, who is the center head for the Seabed 2030 Atlantic and Indian Ocean Regional Center. So Vicki, you have the floor for our panel discussion.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Tommy and Casey for those great talks to kick us off. So to start the panel, I just want to introduce the panelists. We have Marcelo Sperle, we have Veerle Huvene, we have Carrie Howell and David O'Sullivan. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves and just give us a brief summary about what they do and how their projects relate to mapping and exploration in the Atlantic and perhaps in the South Atlantic specifically. I guess I should say who should go first. So I'll go with Marcelo first.
Okay, Vicki, thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here representing Brazil. So I should say that the Brazilian Marine Geology and Geophysics program that we call PGGM was founded in 1969 and nowadays integrates a network of over 27 Brazilian academic and scientific institutions. So far, this covers from north to south Brazil about 8,000 kilometers of coastline represented in the PGGM group. Over the last 52 years, the PGGM has actively contributed to the elaboration, education, public policies, to increase the knowledge of the Brazilian and South Atlantic continental margin in its various aspects: scientific, academic, strategic, and national security, environmental management, and formation of undergraduate and graduate students. So since its foundation for more than 50 years ago, we met annually to discuss and propose projects together for the South Atlantic. These results are widely published, and also we define the main Brazilian policies for the exploration of marine research in the South Atlantic. So all of our activities are based on the geological and geophysical mapping of the seabeds and involve mineral and environmental exploration projects. So we have a very wide network, scientific network, that we could help a lot, we think, in mapping the South Atlantic. That's all.
Great, thank you. Veerle?
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. So I'm Veerle Huvene. I'm a principal researcher and team leader for seafloor and habitat mapping at the National Oceanography Center in Southampton. And so in our institute, we have several projects and programs on seafloor mapping, where we heavily rely and use the latest developments in robotic technology. So we contribute a lot towards the development of robotic technology to support our mapping work. We contribute also to, as I said, the large programs like Seabed 2030, EMODnet, bathymetry, and so on. But today in this panel, maybe like Tommy said, I'm wearing several hats, but I'm mainly wearing the hat of our contribution to the iAtlantic project. So I'm also leading the work package on mapping in that project. And so again, Tommy has already referred to that. iAtlantic is one of the Horizon 2020 projects funded under the BLEM statement, so with an explicit remit to extend our Atlantic research into the South Atlantic as well. And the aim of the project is to create an integrated assessment of the iAtlantic ecosystems in space and in time. But iAtlantic therefore focuses specifically at the open ocean and the deep ocean, the benthic system. The project has 5 objectives, and you can read more about it in a PowerPoint that will be shared with the people in this webinar at the end of the webinar. But one of the objectives is ocean mapping, seafloor and habitat mapping, and in that context, we aim to work at 3 nested scales. So we have activities at the basin-wide scale. We also focus on specific key regions, and then we have some of the most innovative and new development work at very local scales. So in terms of mapping, we include collection of new data. We try to unearth data sets that have been gathering dust on people's shelves for years and have not been accessible. We also use that data towards the development of habitat maps, species distribution models, predictions under future climate change. And as I said, it also includes an important component of technological development.
Great, thank you. How about David?
Hi, how you doing, folks? My name is David O'Sullivan. I am Irish and I work here in Inframar in the Marine Institute. I work with Tommy Fury, who's just after given the introductory speech there. So I work with the value-added program of Inframar and the development of seabed maps and how they're used within multiple marine sectors. I'm a marine biologist by trade, so I would have interest in fisheries and habitats and how seabed maps can be used to delineate habitats. So there's obviously a lot of expertise in the group here. I'll leave the experts in the group talk about that, but and I'm also here to talk as an early career scientist. And about 10 years ago, when I was coming out of college, I realized that seabed maps could be used to study habitats much better than snorkeling around them. So I'm going to talk about how I got from A to B to C and ended up on a transatlantic survey representing my continent to go into the Arctic Circle, and have led a Sea Rover survey, which was a very comprehensive assessment of Ireland's marine biodiversity as a chief scientist RV study. Very much. That should do it.
Great, thanks. And finally, last but not least, Carrie.
Thanks, Vicki. I'm Carrie Howell. I'm a deep sea ecologist from Plymouth University in the UK, and I'm head of the Deep Sea Conservation Research Unit. And the mapping work I'm involved with is really very much focused on producing maps to support a marine spatial planning and spatial management of the marine environment. So we spend a lot of time mapping the distribution of species and habitats. But bathymetry mapping is the basis of all of that. And so this work of mapping the Atlantic is extremely important. We've been doing a lot of work in the South Atlantic of late as part of Mission Atlantic that Tommy's already introduced, so I won't cover that again. But also 2 other programs, One Ocean Hub, and also the Blue Belt program, which are both UK funded. And that work's been focused particularly around the UK overseas territories of Ascension, St Helena and Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic. But through the Mission Atlantic program and the One Ocean Hub, we're working with partners in Ghana, Namibia, South Africa, Brazil, Uruguay and Argentina to try to produce South Atlantic comprehensive habitat maps, both at broad scales and very fine scales, using things, as Veerle mentioned, like species distribution modeling techniques. And so, yeah, we're really very excited to be here and just cannot speak highly enough of the importance of bathymetry mapping. So thank you.
Great, and I guess I'll give just a little more context about myself. As has been mentioned, I lead one of the regional centers for Seabed 2030, focused on the Atlantic, hence my involvement with this group, but also the Indian Ocean. I'm also very deeply involved with data management and bathymetry and subsea floor data for the US academic community. So my roots run deep in all of these kinds of data and bringing it together and making it interoperable and accessible. Okay, so what we're going to do for the next 20 minutes or so is maybe 25 if we're lucky, have a bit of a conversation about some topics that maybe we can provide some success stories on, some lessons learned that can help inform the scaling up of mapping efforts and collaboration really throughout the entire Atlantic basin. So the first question, which will really be open to all panelists, and again, we really want this to be a conversation, is what role can international research projects play in mapping the Atlantic? So anybody that wants to start, I'll just let it be free form. And if nobody speaks, I will, but I'm sure you have things to say.
I'm happy to take that on. As I'm representing a large international research project or several large international research projects. I would say, in my view, they can really be a driver for new collaborations across the Atlantic. Put a few scientists in a room together and give them a subject to talk about, and they'll become they'll very quickly start making connections and interact, and that will grow into a stronger network later. So again, it has been mentioned in the presentations this morning before, the precursor of the iAtlantic project, which was called Atlas, actually was very instrumental at setting up the Aspire initiative, because the first Proto-Aspire meeting happened in the framework of one of the Atlas meetings. So it's a vehicle to bring people together. Besides that, large research projects are a chance to launch research expeditions, and most of them will include some form of bathymetry collection, or will give a platform which we then can use for at least some opportunistic bathymetry data collection along transit lines or something. And scientists tend to go to places that not many other people tend to go to. So in terms of filling the boxes on the Atlantic map, we tend to go to places that are not visited very often, and therefore there is more chance to fill the boxes that otherwise might stay empty.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
I'm looking for a raise hand button, but I can't find it.
Just speak.
Pretend
we're in the room.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Veerle. I think these international collaboration is absolutely key, and it presents an opportunity to network. And again, you know, through Mission Atlantic, we've made contact with folks who are interested in habitat mapping in you know, in Brazil, and through that to Argentina, and then through the One Ocean Hub equally from South Africa, making contacts in Uruguay. And it's making those networks, and those networks are so important to what we're trying to do here, because it requires a huge level of coordination and collaboration, and also relationships and trust between partners, and that takes time to build up, I think. And so these international projects and you know, having funding to work together on a common project and common goals, you know, builds those relationships and builds that trust. And I think it's yeah, imperative going forward that we continue with these large international projects.
Yeah, and I'll add from my perspective, with my Seabed 2030 hat on, that these are the kinds of activities that really lay the foundation for what we're trying to do. We're trying to build on efforts at local, regional scales to really help us achieve our global goals. And it's the good work of all people working in this space that we can put together, where the sum is bigger than the whole. You know, everything together is a much better answer and a much more complete solution, I guess. Any other comments on this question?
Yes, Vicki. I could say that in our projects, we deal mostly with marine geology and geophysics in an integrated way. So it will be very important to be partners of the Aspire for the mapping in the South Atlantic, whether for purpose of scientific knowledge associated maybe with the genesis and evolution of the South Atlantic in its various aspects, but also applied to exploration of living resources, minerals. We have a number of projects now in Brazil where we are exploring the high seas. So therefore, seafloor mapping, we think, is the basis for all our hydrographic, oceanographic, geological, or geophysical projects. And of course, the South Atlantic is very wide. We have many lakes to fill. So I think this effort to make partnership with South American countries and also with Africa countries is fundamental for this.
Absolutely. All right, so maybe we'll move on to another question. What are the challenges in developing large international research projects and their seabed mapping components? And also maybe think about what are the big challenges that we might expect for mapping in the South Atlantic. It's a bit of an extension of what we were just talking about.
I can start again. And actually, I'm going to pick up on something that Kerry mentioned already. She dropped the word funding, and I think that's actually to go and map. I mean, the Atlantic Ocean is a vast place. So we've heard the metrics of how much is mapped only and how much still has to be mapped. And these are big expeditions, big operations. So a good funding model is really necessary to get the ships out there and to do the mapping. And in that sense, I would advocate for not just a good funding model, but a coordinated funding model that goes across the Atlantic, that actually makes the sides of the Atlantic talk to each other. Because again, referring to previous constructs where the EU has a number of funding programs, but then can't fund people in Canada, for example. Now, thanks to some of the funding models in Horizon 2020, we can actually fund some of our Brazilian or South African partners, but it would be ideal if both sides and North and South would come together and get a construct that, because trying to line up programs from the States, for example, and then combine it with a ship that's being sent out from Europe and make sure that everybody gets there at the same time. It's so much logistics, so much headache, and all that time and effort could be used to actually do the mapping or do the science rather than doing the logistics.
Yes, I agree totally with this. Here in Brazil, we have the experience of participating of very large expeditions in the South Atlantic, working together with American and European agencies and universities. But, you know, here in the Southern Oceans, we don't have a very wide infrastructure. I mean, we don't have dedicated research vessels for doing this mapping. At least in Brazil, in the Brazilian continental margin, I would say we have a very, very good infrastructure. But to go to the high seas, for sure, we'll need to make partners with you from the North Atlantic mainly, because we'll need to share ship time in this research vessel. But of course, we have a plenty experience to work in this large expedition, as I said, in the South Atlantic. So I think it will be very productive for everyone.
Gary?
Yeah, I think that access to ships and resources is a big, a slightly bigger challenge in the South Atlantic than it is in the North Atlantic. And the mapping work we've been involved with in the South Atlantic has used European vessels coming down from the North Atlantic, and it just seems that's, you know, not the best way of doing things. And so I think increasing access to vessels is really important, but particularly for South Atlantic nations. Yeah, so you know, those nations bordering the South Atlantic need access to those vessels. And I think that's perhaps where philanthropy can come in and play a role, particularly under the Ocean Decades coming up. You know, the likes of Schmidt Ocean Institute, RevOcean, and others are perhaps able to provide access to the kinds of equipment and resources needed to do this kind of work in deep water, at least. to those nations who perhaps have less access to that sort of technical capability. So it's about technology transfer, building capacity, and provision of access, widening access.
So one thing that I'll add from my perspective is, as research vessels and exploration vessels are out there doing their work, while it's certainly arguably better to be collecting data in a survey pattern, a dedicated survey, to really get a lot of data at once. In the US, we've had huge success with opportunistic data collected during transits. And as someone who catches that data and works with it and synthesizes it into product, I just wanted to remind everyone that even if you don't have a sonar specialist on board who'll be processing the data and monitoring the system really closely, it's definitely worth turning the sensor on and collecting data if the system will run, because someone like myself or my group or lots of other people can catch that data and work with it. It's such a unique opportunity given the vastness of the ocean and the sparseness of data that exists. We should really be aspiring to collect as much data as possible and really promoting that. Opportunistic isn't the best, but it does give us a huge amount of data coverage that when we piece it all together actually creates very coherent maps of the seafloor. So not necessarily a preferred option, but an important one. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna really advocate that by giving an example. So we've been using opportunistic collected data from the South Atlantic, from the high seas, in our predictive modeling work, and it's been invaluable. So it's little patches of information, but it's still better than no information. So so really just strongly support opportunistic data collection whenever possible.
There's a question in the chat that relates to a question I was going to ask. So I'll see if I can summarize it a little bit, which is there a consistent logical sequence from data acquisition to information interpretation and modeling, such as integrated ecological assessment models and habitat mapping. This involves technological development, but also development of new data treatment and processing techniques. So I guess the first answer is mapping first tends to be what's done. And to follow up with what we were just talking about, making sure that any new mapping effort or any new, seafloor work that we're doing that involves maps, that you do some research first to see if data exists, right? And so the IHO Data Center for Digital Bathymetry is a good place to start. And Jen will be telling us more about that later. But really starting to work together as a community, which we're seeing more and more, particularly with the motivation, I think, of Seabed 2030, but also the community was really moving toward this anyway. The timeliness of all this, I think, is very natural, where we're exchanging information about collecting data in advance, or being a little bit more open with data holdings before they're fully released and processed. But that was a little bit of a response to this question. Do any of you want to try to address this question, particularly, I guess, with respect to benthic habitat mapping, et cetera? Go for it.
I totally agree with Luis Conti that yes, the first sequence is very important and getting more and more established, but trying to get more out of the data through the new technological developments and the new data treatment techniques. So that's also why, for example, in the iAtlantic project, within our mapping work package, so it's included, we have this technological development compartment with machine learning, with development of new types of camera sampling systems, new modeling approaches, new data analysis approaches, because yeah, we have so little data about the ocean. We have to squeeze everything out of it that we can.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Well, just following on from that, I think, as Veerle well knows, one of the difficult things in once you've collected, particularly the biological side of things. So the seafloor mapping side of things is the first stage of mapping, absolutely. And then, of course, you need to put the information on top of that, so you get the information on the biology. But the difficulty with the biology data is it's just so horribly time consuming to process. I mean, and it is the bottleneck, you know. I see Veerle nodding. It is the bottleneck in everything that we do, is how long it takes to process that data. And there's huge archives of data that are sitting unprocessed because we just don't have the capacity to get to them. But techniques like artificial intelligence, and again in Mission Atlantic, and I think iAtlantic the same, you know, looking at applying artificial intelligence to image processing to speed up the rate at which we can pull biological quantitative information from image data, so that it can then be used in habitat suitability models and species distribution models, which of course brings the bathy data back in to predict where species and habitats will be found. And that's how we map the biology. So these new techniques and approaches are absolutely critical to speeding up the mapping of the oceans. And I'm talking very much about the biological mapping in all its forms. Because I don't think the problem anymore is that we can't collect the data. On the biological side, we can collect the data. We simply cannot process it at the rate at which it's collected at the moment. So that's a massive nut to crack that I know quite a few people are working on, including ourselves in Mission Atlantic.
Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit as we're starting to get a little bit tight on time. So the next question I'm going to ask David to answer first, but how has international collaboration on seabed mapping impacted your career development?
How are you doing, Vicki? Thanks for that.
Sure.
I would say there would be a positive correlation between my career and seabed mapping. As I said earlier, I'm here to speak for early career scientists. I'm a marine scientist for 10 years. I don't know if that exactly makes me an early career marine scientist or not, but as I said a while ago, not so long ago, I was snorkeling around the south coast of Ireland, making habitat maps and counting sea urchins, and that led to a paper which was published and brought me into the Marine Institute. And from there, again, I'm starting to look at the interaction between different species and the benthic habitats, and produce studies on commercial species of fish like herring and nephrops. And the underlying data, one of the most important underlying data sets within all this was multi-beam data, and how you could delineate backscatter, and how you could delineate seabed classification, bathymetry, and how that linked to species and environments and habitats. Totally fascinating. And somewhere along the way, I realized that Ireland had a national seabed mapping program, which I had to admit I didn't know when I joined the Marine Institute, that it was as advanced as it was. I was able to move into that. And as a career progression, you know, you get to learn things like hydrographic surveys, and this is another bow in someone's career or someone's CV. And from there, all of a sudden, I'm on this international transit. I'm going across the Atlantic. So having Infomar, having this large collaboration in Ireland early on, and Ireland seabed mapping dates back to 20, 30 years, but to the Geological Survey, the Irish National Seabed Survey. And that led on to Infomar. These themselves are collaborations. They're working on different government agencies within Ireland. I mean, that's expanded to the Atlantic with the Galway Statement. It's signed here in the Marine Institute. Infomar are central to that from a European point of view, but obviously also there's other European partners. But it was a big thing for us in Infomar. And then we're dealing with at NOAA more. We're talking to the Canadian Hydrographic Service. We're running international transects. So this huge door of opportunity opens for someone who's, has a marine biology and a hydrographic surveying background. So if you can piggyback along that and take your opportunities as they come along, there's benefits to it. So yeah, my career has progressed along from there. And then, we have to be able to be in those positions to pivot, to take these challenges, to understand the opportunities when they come. And that led on to Sea Rover, which was quite a large scale collaborative project in Ireland, where we mapped the abundance and distribution of sensitive habitats. But that was a collaboration between the Irish government, lots of government departments here in Ireland, Plymouth University. I worked with Kerry. She was on a number of the surveys. We had lots of project partners, and it would be remiss of me to try and remember to say them all. But this survey came about because of these partnerships that have been developed over time. And as long as you can as I said, be in that position to pivot, to take your opportunities as they come. You never know where it's going to bring you, and you never know what you're going to get out of it. So we're sitting now on this massive network of political people and this abundance and distribution of sensitive habitats, which has led again now to maybe looking into the Atlantic. How are we going to do that further into the Atlantic? So very positively, in a very short answer.
I was going to say, when I was a graduate student, I was very isolated in a lab with mostly just my advisor working on multi-beam data, and the world is very different now, which is wonderful to see. In our last couple minutes, does anybody else have anything to add about capacity development and maybe opportunities within your programs to bring early career people into the mix? I know in the GEBCO community, there's a training program that has been very successful at engaging different parts of the world, but maybe some of you have some insight or some thoughts on this. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead first.
Well, I was just going to say on the capacity building side of things and training side of things, I think lots of the large European projects, Atlantic, Mission Atlantic, all have a sort of a huge early career presence in there, and training programs for early career scientists, which is really, really great. But I think there's an issue around training early career people, particularly from nations who have not traditionally been able to engage in deep sea science or mapping, particularly for whatever reason. And one of the things I found with working with our partners in South Africa and Namibia is that, you know, there are people who can do these things, but there just simply aren't enough of them. And so there's capacity that needs to be built in terms of people capacity to really engage in these big programs, because it's always the same few people and they're massively overworked because they're engaging in all these big programs. And so there's a definite people capacity building that would be great to have happen and to support the sort of development of early career scientists, particularly from these nations that have got, you know, all of the burden is falling onto the same people's shoulders. So that needs to kind of broaden to help engagement.
Yes, I could say that since I started to work with oceanography by the ends of the 80s, so far almost 40 years, we have also a very important collaboration with foreign universities in Brazil. I would say that this collaboration was part of my background. We made a very big project for mapping the whole Brazilian continental margin during the 70s, the 80s, almost the 90s, where we have a partnership with the Lamont-Doherty Earth Laboratory, Scripps Institution, Woods Hole, Fremer, and so on. So for us here in the PGGM now, as I said, we have almost 27 institutions. Most of them are universities. So our tradition is to make partners with other countries in order to give opportunity to our students, undergraduates or graduate students, to have also this background. So I think partnership, collaborations, and you know, PGGM works, deals with marine geology and geophysics. So all the time we do mapping. Mapping the seafloor, mapping the seabed is fundamental for any of our projects. So we're very open to this. And also we invited students from Europe, US, Africa. We have a plenty number of African students now participating in our graduate programs.
Great. Thank you for that. I am going to end the panel now because we're a little bit tight on time, but thank you all for your contributions. There are a few questions in the Q&A that the panelists can probably try to answer in typed form after we aren't speaking live. But thank you again, and I hope everyone found this useful. I'm going to pass it back to Terry, I think, who will introduce the final phase of this event. Thanks.